The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
Well, thank you so much, Elliot. It is wonderful to be here. I want to acknowledge Tim Penny and Mark Kennedy for those nice greetings on the video. I think you all know Mark is doing a great job out in Washington teaching at GW, combining his private sector experience that he has, which is so extensive, with his extensive experience in Congress. And I hope one day I'll speak at his class, so I'll say that to the video. And then also, Tim Penny was just out in Washington. He's done an incredible job speaking at a national forum with what he's done with Southern Minnesota in terms of looking at things regionally, in terms of what the business needs and what the potential growth is there. Not as what's been happening so often, each town competing with each other for a new business or for a new school, but instead looking at the region and what their top potential is for expansion. So he's been doing great work too. And it's just fun to be here. I work with many of you. Our staff works with many of you, and I've decided that no matter where I am in the state, I'm continually impressed by the entrepreneurial spirit of Minnesota. Our state brought the world everything from the pacemaker to the Post-it note. We are now second per capita for Fortune 500 companies. Do you know which the first is? Connecticut. But I figure they're the size of an iceberg, so it doesn't really matter. But we also are the hub, as you know, for so many incredible industries, from innovation to medicine to medical device, agriculture, machinery, food processing, insurance, finance, retail. I hope I didn't forget anyone. And we are really excited about what's going on in our state right now. The strong foundation that we have right here in this room is one of the reasons that we were able to weather the downturn better than a lot of states. And I'm not being Pollyannish about this. I know it's still not easy, and it certainly wasn't easy over the last few years. I was thinking as when Elliot was up here of what that was like during the financial downturn and our banks and what was going on. I remember at the time having worked closely with our community banks, our mid-sized banks, with US Bank, with Wells Fargo, TCF, knowing that our banks weren't really the cause of this downturn. They were not the ones engaged in this risky behavior and some of the stuff that we saw on Wall Street, yet we were being hurt by our stock prices, by what was happening in the financial markets. And I remember I wrote a piece at the time after talking to them that got published in the Washington Post and kind of went viral. And it was supposed to be entitled, because I conjured up this notion of a Midwestern banker with his briefcase with a bunch of credit default swaps flying around above his head saying, Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. And so it had that strain through the piece about Midwestern banks. And they actually, I suggested that they titled it, Not All Banks Went to Oz, but instead they titled it, Some Banks Had a Brain. And so it became kind of a cult piece around the country. But when I look back at that time, especially like January of 2009, where we literally lost 800,000 jobs in the country, more jobs than there are people in the state of Vermont. And it was a very difficult time. I was the only senator at the time. The recount was going on. I would literally, after a while, everyone had bad news, the retailers, the real estate agents. We just a parade of problems going on. And I finally just started to take notes of anyone that had good news at the time. And of course, the first was low-end beer. They did really well in the downturn. I think you can figure out why. The second was Hormel, because Spam does really well in a downturn. If you've looked at what's been going on there. Makeup. Women buy a lot of makeup during a downturn. That's historically true. Digital TVs. Best Buy was doing well at the time because of the digital TV transition. And then I finally had a group of doctors come to visit me. And they said, it's just a disaster. People are putting off elective surgery. And I said, well, is there any area where you've seen improvement? Anything where things are actually looking up? And they said, well, yeah, one. And I said, what's that? And they said, vasectomies. And so I looked the next 2 weeks after that in USA Today, there was this article, huge headline, that vasectomies were up during the downturn. So about a month after that, I went to the White House Correspondents' Dinner to this small party, and who was there but Warren Buffett? This is a true story. I went over to him, I said, you know, Mr. Buffett, we are doing so much work on the stimulus side, and I would really like your ideas on the private sector side, what we could be doing to do more work with our businesses. And so he said some things, and then I said, then the other thing I'm just curious about is why certain businesses are doing better. And I went through the whole thing of the low-end beer and the makeup and the digital TVs and the makeup, digital TVs, movies I mentioned, and vasectomies. And he looks at me, this is a true story, he goes, Senator, that is a very interesting economic trend analysis. And I said, well, thank you, Mr. Buffett. And he goes, the only problem is the end. And I said, well, what's wrong with the end? He said, you can only get one vasectomy. It's a true story. All right, so since that, things have improved, and let's remember that as we wade through the problems of Washington and all of the challenges that you have. Private sector employers have added more than 1.2 million jobs over the past 6 months alone, and that's in virtually every industry across the board. At 7.6%, the national unemployment rate is at its lowest point in more than 4 years, although the long-term unemployment rate, people out for more than 6 months, is still way too high. In Minnesota, our unemployment rate is more than 2 points better than the national average at 5.4%. But I think you all know that we have much work to do because we don't just want to be stable and better than we were 4 years ago. We actually want to improve. And that's why I have been talking for years now about a competitive agenda for this country, that we need to come together, because I think it's a way to bring us together as a team, as a country, across party lines, across geographic lines. And that is a simple idea, that we need to be a country that makes stuff again, that invents things, that exports to the world, that we love our financial sector, but we can't base the whole economy on churning money, that it also has to be about going back to the brass tacks of making things in this country. Exports, which I noted that Congressman Kennedy nicely brought up on that video there, has been, I think, the first thing that I think is key to moving this country out of where we are. And I worked very hard to get on the President's Export Council because I think that is got to be the focus. As you know, he's set a goal of doubling exports in 5 years. And when we had our first meeting just about a month ago, we focused on some very specific issues like the bilateral investment treaties with India, the commercial engagements with Sub-Saharan Africa, which, as you all know, is one of the fastest growing regions in the country for trade, and also the importance of an international service agreement to reduce barriers to exports of American services. There was some discussion, which I'm hoping is going to continue, with some of the export controls in the defense area. As we look at some ramping down of defense spending, we should be augmenting it in ways to make it easier for these companies to export while still being very careful to protect national security, but looking at some of the small parts and other things they make where there's really big barriers for exports that I think could change. Obviously, we're heading into looking at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which, if done right, could be very good for this country, as well as looking at a potential trade agreement with the European countries. I was, in fact, out in Munich with Senator McCain at a national security conference, and 4 of us met with the senators, met with Vice President Biden and about 15 CEOs from European countries, and obviously they're very interested in that right now, given the fragile nature of the economy in Europe. And also, we discussed little problems with it, like the vice president raised chickens. Delaware is a big chicken state. And so we clearly have some work to do still with some of the unfair situations that could be created, but I'm hopeful we can move forward on that. Another area, tourism, which is very important in our state. I was just at the opening last night of the Radisson Blu, the new hotel at the Mall of America. I suggest you walk by if you haven't seen it, or walk through, and you can go shopping at the same time. It is really important to our country, and I think people always thought about it as just a sideshow, recreation, doesn't matter. But it's something like 1 out of 8 jobs in the country is related to tourism. And what the tourism industry did the last few years, I headed up that subcommittee, and we worked very hard to build coalitions with retail and others that were helped by tourism. The sad fact is, since 9/11, America lost somewhere around 15% of our business in the international trade market, which means that it wasn't because of the economy, it just went elsewhere. Why did it go elsewhere? Well, we obviously had to change our security measures because of 9/11, but we then didn't adjust how we handled those security issues and how we handled the tourism visas. So what was going on was you could get a tourism visa to go to Great Britain if you were in Shanghai in about 3 days, and it took you 90 days to get one to the US. Guess where they went? Every point we lost was about 165,000 jobs. It was unbelievable what went on. And we are now finally turning that around. If you talk to anyone in the hotel industry, we're finally starting to see the light in the tunnel for 2 reasons. We started advertising our country internationally, something we had never done before in key markets like in Asia, in Canada and other places. We're paying for that by a combination of private sector revenues and then also something called the Travel Promotion Act, which is not taxpayer money, but it's a $10 fee on foreign visitors when they come here. They do that to us all the time. You are paying for them when you get your visas to advertise their country in our country, but we haven't been doing the same thing. So we have finally created an equal playing field, and the second thing is biggest improvement in the visa times. I think we're trying to get down to 2 days in Brazil now. Our biggest focuses were China, India, and Brazil. It's not just about tourism. Mayo hates this. They can't get patients in because it takes too long. Business meetings some of you may have had where you can't get people that are your customers or your affiliates in the door to even talk about what you want to do together on business matters. So this has been one of my major focuses as head of the Travel Caucus. In the immigration bill, there's something called the JOLT Act, which makes some great improvements with visa waivers and other things. It's a big part of tourism. And just to give you the number, today we've seen improvements to the degree that we've recovered nearly 60% of the jobs that we lost during the period where we had lost those jobs. So that's a big improvement. We have so much more to do. So when you hear about tourism, don't laugh at it. It's a big job generator in our state, and we're going to keep focused on that. Second piece, first was exports, trade, exports. The second thing, this competitive agenda, is job training. No one knows that better than in Minnesota, where a recent poll, the Minnesota State of Manufacturing poll, showed that 60% of the respondents in our state said that it was hard for them to find workers with the right skills and experience, which is up from 40% in 2010. Same company did the polling, same group answered the question. So that is a major shift. It's a good problem to have, I will admit, in that we have job openings, but it's also something that has to be remedied. Because I'm sure many of you have heard this, but particularly in greater Minnesota, where we literally have the town of Benson looking for 60 people. AgCode down in Jackson cannot find a welder. We've got people that need to repair the robotics equipment and manage the robotics equipment for our medical device manufacturer. So a lot of this is emphasizing science, technology, engineering, math from the start. I have a bill to double the number of STEM schools. We have to do at least that. Secondly, getting the kids, when they're in high school, engaged in these 2-year and 1-year degree programs. Germany has done a fantastic job of this, and we are lagging behind. There has to be incentives. As you know, most education is paid for on the state level, but there has to be federal incentives that are geared toward schools that are willing to take on those kinds of programs and work with our VOTEC to get those kids into those jobs, because otherwise they're graduating either with no degrees at all, or they're going to get a 4-year degree, probably not completing it, or completing it and then can't find a job. And so giving them this possibility of manufacturing, which is no longer your grandpa's manufacturing. As you know, these factory floors are clean, they're complex. You can't just usually go to these jobs with a high school education. And it's a great potential for us in our state, given the amount of manufacturing we have. Related to that is immigration reform, and that is one of those areas where there are great strides being made. Senator Orrin Hatch and I have done a lot of work together. Maybe it is because of the Washingtonian magazine, this is true story, voted us the 2 senators least likely to get into a scandal. That's true story. And I assume that includes with each other, but in any case, we have done a number of bills together, and one of them is the I-squared bill, which Congressman Kennedy was referring to, which is the Immigration Innovation Bill. And that is all about trying to up the number of green cards in our country so that when students come here and study at places like the University of Minnesota, that we don't just send them back the day after they graduate to start the next Google in India. That is not what we want to do. We want them to be able to stay here and invent things. And you look at what has made our country what it is today, it's all about immigration. 90 of our Fortune 500 companies are headed by immigrants. 200 of them are headed by children of immigrants. A great number of our U.S. Nobel laureates, including Albert Einstein, were immigrants. And if we just shut that door down because of other problems which do exist on the illegal immigration side, we're doing no one a favor, because every one of these, to jump from green cards to H-1B visas, the studies has shown that every one of these H-1B visas creates 2 to 5 jobs, depending on what the area is, in America. And so that's why this is part of the solution, not the whole solution. The bill that I did with Orrin Hatch and Marco Rubio also included an increased fee on the visas, with the Chamber of Commerce supported heartily, and that fee is to be used for STEM education of our own students in America. It came to between $3 to $5 billion in 10 years. Now, the Gang of Eight took most of our bill. They actually took the money from the visa fee to put it toward other things, so we're going to try to change some of that back, what Rubio and I are and Hatch, but it is a good part of the bill and important, and we worked with the unions, the Gang of Eight did, to get an agreement on some of the concerns that were legitimate about firms that were only outsourcing firms that were using these visas, and we will go from there. But the immigration bill is an incredibly exciting thing. We're going to have markups all month in the Senate. We've had a hearing last Monday with 23 witnesses, and everyone from the head of the migrant workers to Grover Norquist testified for the bill. He is now going to be my witness at the joint economic hearing next week, which I'm very much looking forward to. Next part, so we've got exports, job training. The third thing is deficit reduction, reducing the debt. This has not been an easy path, but we are making more progress than we have in the past through a number of sort of ugly measures instead of doing one big deal, which I think would have been better for everyone. But probably the worst part about it, in addition to that nightmare over the debt ceiling, which I really appreciated the support of, I think 15 CEOs of major companies sent me individual letters to read on the record during that time. But the last New Year's Eve was lovely. That was when we voted till 2 in the morning, and I can tell you it is every girl's dream to spend New Year's Eve, the stroke of midnight, with Harry Reid on your left and Mitch McConnell on your right. But that was my New Year's Eve. And so we were able to do some things with the Bush tax cuts, as you know, setting the income level at $400,000 and above, where they would revert back to the Clinton levels. And we also have done some spending cuts that made sense, and now the sequestration, which I think needs to be replaced with a combination of spending cuts, so that you will have some of these spending cuts, but not of the nature where it's like a hammer, instead of more of a thoughtful way of doing the spending cuts, at least half is what I would throw out there. The president has proposed some Medicare reform as well, and then we have the revenues and some of the loopholes. Of course, everyone's loophole is someone else's incentive, probably right in this room, but we are going to have to make some changes in order to bring the debt down. The most common wisdom with the economists is we need to get to about $4 trillion. We're at $2.4 trillion in 10 years. That obviously won't eliminate the debt, but it'll show that we're serious about doing something about it without causing, as Chairman Bernanke calls it, a sharp contraction. For all the women, I like that because it reminds me of labor. But we don't cause a sharp contraction to our somewhat fragile recovery by doing something too soon, but to do it over a 10-year period so that we really show that we're serious and that we get the investment coming in again. As you know, there's a lot of capital out there that can be invested. So you've got the exports, the workforce training, which includes immigration reform, the debt reduction, and then, of course, your favorite topic, the comprehensive tax reform. This idea that the business tax rate, which I believe is set too high in our country when you compare things internationally. Now, that being said, as someone who supports bringing it down as well as bringing down some of the business tax rates of other companies that aren't corporations, that we have to pay for it some way. And that is what's going to be our duty over the next year and a half. Max Baucus deciding not to run, well, I like him personally, was probably a way that paves the way to getting this tax reform done. It's hard to take on a major task as a chairman of a committee when you're also running for office, and he is devoted to have this be part of his legacy to get this comprehensive tax reform done. And I think we should take him at his word and believe that we're going to start working on this. And there's some work being done on the House side on a bipartisan basis, which usually doesn't happen, tackling some different parts of this, which I think is really important. We care about this a lot in Minnesota. Most Minnesota businesses want that overall tax rate to go down, and obviously some of them are very well aware of the what we will call loopholes or sometimes called incentives, but for the most part what I hear from our companies is they would like rates to go down and paid for by closing some of the loopholes. So that's exciting. One thing, if you don't believe me, like I'm living in a fairy tale that this can happen, one little good point of what's been going on in the Senate, in addition to the Senate getting the Farm Bill done with a $23 billion debt reduction component of that Farm Bill over what we had the last time, still waiting over in the House, getting the Patent Reform Bill done, called the America.She Act, really important to Minnesota, very complicated bill, getting the Transportation Bill done with Inhofe and Boxer, coming to an agreement. I've got about 10 examples for you of things the Senate did with very cumbersome rules because there is really a seriousness about moving forward on legislation. But the one thing I'd note in the tax area as a good sign, as I see Best Buy here, is the Marketplace Fairness Act, which is, I think, was shocked everyone in the budget votes that we got 75 votes for that in the Senate out of 100. Only 25 people voted against it when people were scared to touch it 5 years ago. Part of that is because Republican governors as well as Democratic governors across the country are losing $23 billion every year on the online sales tax revenue. Online retail started as small and it was kind of a fun thing, and now as we know it's a booming business, and all we're trying to do is create an even playing field for our businesses, both big and small. After this I'm going over to a baby store on Grand Avenue to hit home the point that this is also about a lot of our mom and pop stores who are losing business to online retailers. And in fact, the bill is supported by every small business in Minnesota, from the UFTA store in Red Wing to Sleepy Eye Forest in Sleepy Eye. So there's broad support, and we think it's going to pass the Senate next week, and we're really excited about that, and it'll head to the House. So that's a march through what we're doing. It is not an easy time in Washington. I continue to keep my good humor. Part of it is I so enjoy the people that I work with in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans. I truly believe that courage in the next year is not going to be whether you go into the chamber and give a big speech blasting everyone all by yourself. Courage is going to be whether you're willing to stand next to someone you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country. And that's what I try to do every day. So thank you, and I'd love to take any questions that you have. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Well, Senator, thank you. I think we all can tell how fortunate we are to have a senator representing our state that is as knowledgeable and is committed to the economic things that will make our economy better, and we really do appreciate your work on our behalf every day. We have time for questions, and so if anyone has anything they would like to ask the senator, I get the opportunity to choose you or not. And while you're thinking of them, you've got one back here? Okay.
I'm a student at St. Catherine University, and my fellow students and I have seemed to acquired some debt from education. And we were wondering if, as a senator, you believed that the government can or should help students with this debt.
Well, I believe that we should. I'm someone that had a student loan debt myself, and I got it all paid off. And then I met my husband, who's 8 years younger than me, and he had like 30 billion. Oh my God, I'm talking like Washington. He had like 30,000 in debt, which sounds small now, but I married him anyway. So I have some idea of what this is like, and I believe that we do have a role in this because, as I said before, we need to educate our kids. That's why we work so hard to keep the interest rates down on the student loans. They can double again if we don't do anything about it this summer. It's why we took a very difficult act to get the banks out from the middles, and it wasn't necessarily all our banks, but there were a lot of middlemen involved in the fees to bring that out of there. And it's why we're continuing to fund education and look for ways to make it work as best as possible. I do think one of the things that we need to do, as I mentioned earlier, is to make sure the degrees that kids are getting. I mean, we're not going to fund different degrees differently, but we have to start educating parents and kids about where the jobs are and what kind of degrees fit the jobs, because we do have a lot of kids that are getting degrees and they don't have jobs. I'm sure not the kids at your table. I think that we're doing a disservice. You know, towns that do it best, Rochester, they've got the community college down there, but Mayo says, you know what, we're going to need this many doctors in this area, we're going to need nurses mostly in this area, and so they get the colleges to get the degrees that they need. Another great example is Thief River Falls. You probably didn't think I'd say that, but we've got DigiKey up there and we've got Articat. So Northland Community College is up there. The parents and the kids can see the jobs, and they can go to that Northland Community College, or they can go over to Moorhead or Fargo and get a degree and know exactly what that degree would feed into. And so we need, that's much easier where you're in mid-sized towns where you have the companies and the colleges together. It's much harder for inner city kids who can't see that connection, and no one's helping them to see that connection. Brainerd, the superintendent there, is telling me his biggest problem isn't the kids, it's the parents, and thinking, well, I automatically have to get my kid in a 4-year degree when they've got openings at companies right in Brainerd in manufacturing. So I think that it's a combination of the student loan part, very important, but I do not want us to lose sight of the fact that we have to train students in the areas where we have the jobs.
Next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Ivan Fong from 3M. Thank you for your comments, very insightful and refreshing. Thank you also for your leadership on exports and job training and all the other initiatives. You commented on immigration and immigration reform. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how the tragic events in the Boston Marathon might have affected pro or con, and where you think all of this may end up.
Well, that's a good question because, as you know, the tragedy in Boston was an unbelievable disaster for the city of Boston, and they completely rose to the occasion, not only with their first responders, but with the incredibly volunteers. And the image I will never forget is the Bruins game, where they all stood up defiantly and sang the Star-Spangled Banner. That being said, when it first came out, of course, there was a lot of pushback. I was at the judiciary hearing where people implied, like, well, this means we should slow up on immigration reform. The terrorists involved in this were refugees originally in the country and had been here for a long time. So it wasn't one of these overstay of a visa or something like that. So at first, there were cries to delay immigration. But what was amazing about it, in the same way that the city of Boston showed this resiliency, the argument was somewhat resilient on immigration reform. As Republicans came to the front, like Speaker Boehner and Congressman Ryan, and actually said, no, there's good security things in this bill, not only at the border, but in terms of tracking overstays of visas, and this means we should speed it up and not delay it. Democrats, who have been long supportive of the bill, were much more willing to talk about security in the bill, which I thought was really important. It was harder for some of the people on our side to do that. So I think that actually it has not slowed the bill down, and people were very smart about how they talked about it. They acknowledged that there are going to be hard decisions made with this bill, but that we have to keep moving forward. The other thing I'd note for people to take away from this, if you take away one thing, if you haven't read the Boston Globe story about the Chinese immigrant who was the guy who got carjacked by the terrorists, and he was the one that had the presence of mind to get out of that car and leave his cell phone in the car, he is an immigrant on a visa. So let's not forget that as well. All right. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I know her. It's Nancy. I saw someone. It is not a planned.
Is there a question over here?
Okay. Sorry. We worked together before. We'll take someone else's question.
I'm wondering. I'm Nancy Etzweiler with 3M. We go back. I'm wondering, with the State Department and the Commerce Department have been working very hard on export control reform and building narrower but higher fences where it's appropriate. But we've heard there may be some opposition or concern in the Senate, perhaps Senator McCain, and I'm wondering if you can talk about, give your opinion on whether or not you think it's going to ultimately be successful, or where some of the pitfalls might be.
Yeah, well, this comes out of the security versus the commerce sort of situation, and you have to pay attention to both. But as I mentioned, we are cutting down spending in defense. Everyone knows that. I very much hope not at the sequestration levels. But the issue is that we can make some cuts, and we have to. And that means there's workers in these industries. And one of the ways that we can do this without using government funds is to make it easier for component parts to be exported. And there's things called export controls that are put on anything that's used in defense. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to look at this with a new mind and open it up and see which ones we can do without interfering with security, to which countries. They may go to certain countries. And so, of course, this means we're going to have to walk a gauntlet, understandably, on some of the security issues and try to do what's right and work with Senator McCain and others and he does care. I've traveled with him to Vietnam, seen the cell he was kept in, understand that part of his life, but he's also incredibly strong on business and trade issues and has been doing some really brave things on immigration lately, his gun vote on the universal background check. So I'm looking forward to working with him on this, but it is going to involve a lot of different committees in the Senate. I think people understand you always have to be as sophisticated as the economy you're in, and so we're going to have to step back and look at these rules again. Thank you. No, I'll let you call on.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there another one out there? Over here.
Oh, we'll have to do both. We'll do both. I like questions.
Speaking of universal background checks, can you talk about gun control, background checks, and where you think that's happening, not only in the Senate, but in Congress?
Sure. This was actually one of the hardest days in the Senate because putting aside the issue of guns for a second, you had two really conservative senators who were willing to put themselves out and work on something that they felt that could lead to some common ground. That's Senator Manchin of West Virginia, A-rated by the NRA, and Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, A-rated by the NRA. And could I also say that Senator Manchin actually ran TV ads during his campaign in West Virginia for the U.S. Senate that featured him shooting a target with a gun into a target that said cap and trade. Okay, so that's where we are with these two guys. And they, after meeting with the Newtown families, after meeting with these families from Connecticut, became convinced they had to do more. And when you look at the numbers, there's a lot of things, not one thing fits all with this. And everyone knows in our state, the state of hunting, that we cannot do anything that's going to really set us back or set us back in any way for the quality of life in Minnesota and hunting. I always say everything I look at through the lens of, does it hurt my Uncle Dick in the deer stand? Universal background checks step up as one of the things where you have a situation where you do background checks very quickly when people go buy guns at stores, and you don't do them when people buy guns at, depending on the framework, but at gun shows and online. And so all they were trying to do was to plug that exception. Well, the 14 states that have plugged that exception have a 50% reduction in suicides and a similar reduction in domestic homicides. And so have the Newtown families in your office, like I did the morning when that vote failed, and they knew it was going to fail, and realize that they knew that that wouldn't have saved their babies. But they had come to believe that this was a pragmatic answer to something that would save a lot of other people's babies. And so that's why they came together behind that approach. One of the moms in my office that day told the story of how her little boy, and this didn't all come out, I think it was on 60 Minutes, was autistic. That school had a lot of autistic kids. And he couldn't even really speak. He was 8 years old. But they had finally found this health aide for him that he absolutely adored. And he put her picture on his refrigerator. And every day he came home, he would try to pronounce her name. And he was doing better and better. And that day when they were sitting in that fire station with Senator Blumenthal and others, those parents waiting, and kids would come in, and pretty soon the ones who knew they didn't have their kids anymore were left. And the parents in that fire station, that couple said that what they knew was that that kid, if their kid was gone, that health aide would be gone, because she would have never left his side. And they found them together dead with her arms around him. So when you hear those stories, and you know these parents have the courage to do something that they know wouldn't even fix their situation, and you've got two really conservative senators agreeing on this approach, I don't understand it. I think it's very close to getting done. We had 55 votes on it. That's 5 votes short of the filibuster. I think there's some senators that regret their votes. I think there are ways that maybe we could change the bill some, not much, but add some things to it that might be helpful. Senator Manchin has said he's bringing it back, and I hope that he will, and I hope that the country supports that, and I think the numbers show that they do. All right?
Lindsay at Dorsey and Whitney.
Michael Lindsay, I used to work with him too. I didn't set these up at all. I didn't.
Senator, as chair of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, do you have an agenda that you foresee for that committee?
Sure. We've actually had two really good hearings. Senator Mike Lee, Republican, and I co-chair that committee. I consider it that way. He's the ranking member. We've done everything together, every press release together, every announcement together. It's really important to us. We had our first hearing on the American Airlines US Air merger, which I think, I'm not going to go into the details, it's before the Justice Department, but there's some good questions to ask about consolidation in the airline industry and the effect it's going to have on personal travel and business travel. And there's a lot of cities, we happen to be a hub, so we've been surviving this, but there's a lot of cities that are losing a lot of coverage, and I think the Justice Department hopefully will look at some of the factors, if they do approve the deal, that have some conditions. Like at Reagan Airport, it would mean that the combined American US Air would have 70% of the slots. And so I would focus on that as one thing. My guess is they're going to be looking at to put some conditions on any approval of the deal. The second hearing we had was with the new head of Antitrust, Mr. Baer, who used to head up Antitrust at Arnold and Porter and is really, really smart, and has acknowledged that the fact that they haven't been doing much litigating weakens their power on some of these things. And I had met with him for a good half hour before the hearing, and I will say he also is very astute to the international concerns that could actually help American businesses in terms of some of the pricing cartels and things that have been going on that he wants to look at. So I think he's going to be really good. The new head of the FTC also testified, Ramirez. And if you look generally, Michael, at the areas that are going to be a focus of the Justice Department and of our committee, I would say it's no surprise. It is healthcare mergers, some of which the incentives are created by the healthcare reform bill. And so that's going to be an interesting area to figure out what is acceptable and what is not. And I think that is something that I know the Justice Department, the FTC has already struck down some mergers, but I think you're going to see more mergers, including legal ones. Secondly, communications area is always hot for looking at with what goes on. We had some major hearings on Google last year. The third thing would be transportation. I am in favor of getting rid of the exemption on railroads. I thought maybe there'd be one captive customer that would clap, but it's actually a big deal for businesses in greater Minnesota, like Blandon and other companies, because the rates for the last leg of the trips are extraordinarily high, and there hasn't been, we're down to 4 major railroads, which is the exact same number on the monopoly board, I will note. We used to have 63. And so we have actually passed this bill with bipartisan support through the Judiciary Committee in the past. The other alternative, which probably would be easier if the railroads would negotiate with us, was some changes to the Surface Transportation Board rules, which would allow captive customers. My daughter saw it on my schedule once and asked if I was meeting with pirates, but would allow these captive customers to negotiate rates and to be able to challenge rates in a better way. So that's just an example of one transportation thing. People always think about airlines, but there's a lot of other things. And I can't go without mentioning, as I see Rick Calhoun from Cargill back there, that on Monday we're going to start working on, while we finish up the Marketplace Fairness Act, the Water Resources Development Act, which again is Barbara Boxer, Vitter, you can't find two people more different, but have come to an agreement on that, and we're working very hard to get something called the River Act included in that, where the industry has agreed to up their fees in order to do repairs on the locks and dams across the rivers. Because if we want to move forward to be this country that meets these challenges I laid out, that exports and makes things and get things out to the world, and we work on all these other things that I think could get us there, then we also need to have the transportation system that fits that. And that means the next generation of air traffic control, which we've voted for now. That means the barge is working, the bridge is working, like the Stillwater Bridge. Could one person clap for that? No, you guys can't. That I worked so hard on with Michelle Bachmann. And it is not a bridge to nowhere, it's a bridge to Wisconsin. And it means bridges and roadways and rail and everything we need to be functioning well. So I want to thank you for caring enough about business in Minnesota to come to this lunch today. And what I love about our entrepreneurial spirit in Minnesota is we see it not just as individual businesses competing with each other, but we see it as woven into the fabric of our community and the way people work together. Time and time again, major newspaper people, major people that come out and speak, whether it's at the business partnership or the chamber or this group, tell me how impressed they are by the cohesiveness of our business community. And I think you know we rise and fall together. So thank you for the work you do. Thanks.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.